The first Heritage talk of 2026. Very nice to see all you peoples. For those, most of you probably don't know me, I am the new Heritage Librarian at the Whangarei Library. My name is Monique Portegys, so welcome all here today. I'm just going to start with some housekeeping. If there's a fire, run as fast as you put. No, there's some fire exits. The entry you came in, there is an exit also through there, and then there's an exit behind us through the curtains as well. So you can take your pick in the unlikely event that happens. The format for today is going to be a bit of a question and answer session between me and Lauren. So I'm going to hopefully talk a tiny bit, and Lauren will talk a lot. And then we will open it up to the floor for questions, any questions that you may have for her. So now to the main event. It's my great pleasure to introduce Lauren Roche. She is an author as well, and a former GP, and an exceptional woman in her own right. So an exceptional woman writing about an exceptional woman. She has written 2 memoirs, Bent Not Broken and Life on the Line, both of which are in our library. And she's written a fictional novel, Miller and the Boneman, and her latest novel, which is a fictionalised version of one of New Zealand's pioneer businesswoman, Julia Eichardt, A Life of Grit and Grace, and that is what brings her here today. So welcome, thanks for coming.
Thank you. I've promised somebody that I'm going to speak really quickly because she has to get away early. So if you want me to slow down, just... We're not
working?
Your
mic's not on. We'll just, yep.
Here we go, sorry. That better? Yes.
It's not going to be a talk without some technological
There's got to
problems.
be something. I promised someone who's here today that I'd speak really quickly because she has to get away to something else. No, she's changed her mind. I don't have to speak quickly. But I do have a tendency to do that, so if I'm gabbling, just put your hand up. So I'm Lauren, thank you for the invitation, and thanks for coming out on this pretty dreary day.
So I was wondering if we could start with really just talking a little bit about Julia and how you came to write about her.
Yeah. I've written the books that you've talked about, Miller and the Bone Man and the 2 memoirs, and I had another couple of manuscripts that I'd done, one as my AUT creative writing thesis about death, and another one about the writing of Gray's Anatomy in the 1860s in London. And I couldn't find a publisher for these books, and I was speaking to a man who distributes books, and he said, look, I hope this isn't offensive to you, but would you write a book for someone else? Would you write a book on commission? And I said, of course I would. And he said, have you ever heard of Julia Eichardt? And I said yes, although I never had heard of her. And I said I'd be very happy to write her story. Now the story of Julia came about when the publisher of a small business down in Queenstown, his name's Sam Parder Cooper, was talking to his niece, and his niece is at high school at Lake Wakatipu in Queenstown. And the girl said, I can't believe they've divided us up into all these teams in school, and the teams are all named after Queenstown men. And it's a girls' school. They were named after William Rees and von Tunzelman and male explorers and pioneers in Queenstown. And she said, why aren't we under women's names? And he said, well, tell me some prominent Queenstown women. And she couldn't. Because the history of the women in Queenstown is nowhere near as well documented. There aren't statues to the women who helped to build Queenstown. There's one of William Rees. So the women were effectively written out, or not written into the history. Sam had already published a book called Kitty Kay about a woman who was a packer in Queenstown. So he wanted to continue to write stories about prominent women. So that's where Julia came in. I said, yes, I'll do it. They said, send us some historical fiction, so I sent them part of the Anatomist's Handbook. They really enjoyed it, and I learned in 8 months as much about Julia Eichardt as I think anyone's ever known before. So that's how it came about. It was a commissioned book brought about because someone had noticed that people weren't telling the stories of the women of Queenstown.
So can we talk a little bit about what it was like for women in business, and what are some of the structures and the things that they came up against when they were trying to make a living?
First of all, to get to places like Queenstown, most of the women who came as pioneers had to spend months and months on board ship. Julia's mother came from Ireland to Victoria in Australia on a 4-month trip, and she gave birth 2 weeks into the voyage. So the women who came here had already been through a lot of deprivation, privation. A lot of them from Ireland had lost their land. They were affected by famine well before the potato famine. People were coming to find something new, and they thought that they were coming to a country where they could build a new life for themselves and their kids, and where they could be useful and helpful. Most of them arrived into Dunedin in the early days, and Dunedin then was called Mud Eden. There was sewage in the streets. It was full of mud. The women wore crinolines and long, long dresses and little boots, and they were constantly begrimed. You know, they started making little shields for the bottoms of their dresses so they could walk in the mud. To get anywhere from your house, you had to build the house yourself, and it was usually a little whare that was built from bits of flax and fern. That was the initial buildings. And while, you know, you could appreciate the light coming through the gaps in the summer, summer's not a long time in Dunedin. As soon as it started to rain and the snow came, those beautiful little whare weren't nearly as nice. You had to walk for miles and miles to see a neighbour. You had to look after your own animals. You had to milk cows. You had to prepare beasts. You had to cook everything on a little coal range if you had one. Otherwise it was in a pot on a fire. And you had children. About every 2 years you'd pop out another baby. And most of those children, no, not most of them, up to half of those children were expected to die from childhood diseases. It was really hard. Women then also, if you were a young single woman, you had to look after your virtue. It was the most valuable thing you had. You couldn't go on a date unchaperoned. You had to go to balls, and there was always someone watching and chatting. The women who came out to start business, many came and became hoteliers, had to again be these paragons of virtue, you know. Julia Eichardt had to once kick a young man out of her hotel because she'd found a young woman in his room. The young man went on to commit suicide and blamed Julia for his suicide because, yeah. So that was Julia protecting her hotel and its reputation. Also, women who were unmarried had no power over their own money if they were working. Working young women had to give money to their parents. When you're married, your husband took your money. Your property belonged to him. So until about 1888, I think, when the Women's Property Act came in and women were allowed to own stuff. So the powerful women back then were the widows, because widows had built something. They owned something, and the something that they owned actually belonged to them. And it surprised me going back through all the newspapers and things that there were very few black widows. You would think that there would be an incentive to knock your husband off so you could keep your hands on your own things. But there were very few of them, well, that were found out.
Yeah, they're just better at it.
Yeah. So, yeah, there was social isolation. Women came from overseas. They didn't have a family structure here. When you were busy having your babies, you often didn't have your mum or your auntie or your older sister beside you. So a lot of knowledge was lost. or was hard to come by. The plants that grew over here were different, the birds were different, the trees were different. The old remedies that had worked back home, they didn't work here. You had to be able to talk to the people who knew. And yet a lot of the Europeans and Māori didn't communicate well together. Not at the beginning. It was better in the South Island than it was further north, but yeah, there was a lot of knowledge that that they hadn't yet caught up with. There were no schools at the beginning. In Dunedin, in about 1867, they were talking about putting a university. University of Otago opened in 1871. But in the late 1860s, somebody started night classes for people where you could come along and learn about electricity, which was a very new thing, engineering. You could learn about science and botany. The very first night, it was in winter, 250 people turned up. So while there were no schools yet, education was really important. But women were kept out of a lot of education at the beginning. It wasn't thought womanly to be able to work as a doctor. You couldn't be a scientist. Women were kept very much in the housekeeping, nursing and midwifery. The midwives were known as howdies, because when the midwife turned up your house, they'd say, "How do you doing today, Mrs.?" So you could be a howdy, you could be a nurse, you could take in other women's washing or care for their children. And when the schools started, you could teach. But you couldn't do a lot of the more exciting and interesting things.
So you mentioned about widows being, one of the women who had the power because they had the finance. Did women have access to capital if they wanted to start a business?
It was really hard to borrow money if you were a woman without your husband's permission or your father's permission. Some women came over with money. There was a woman called Anne Evans, I can't recall her maiden name, who came over. She'd been working with Florence Nightingale in Crimea, and she came to New Zealand with a pot of money to set up a hospital. It wasn't enough money, and she ended up being William Reese's child's nanny for a while. So women either brought money with them or had to borrow with the permission of the men in the household. Women with money, with families with money, could do so many more interesting things. A lot of women at that time who had wealthy families went to school overseas. There was a rabbi in Melbourne who taught young Jewish women about their faith. So people like Bendix Hellenstein, who was one of the early pioneer men, he sent all of his daughters across to Melbourne to learn about Judaism. He also sent them to Europe. They were expected, young moneyed women in the pioneer days, to be able to read French and Italian and German as well as English. They were expected to be able to play the piano and sing and be charming and delightful.
There is, I think, in addition, there was a point I found out recently that this famous Smith & Co.'s department store was started by Marion Smith, who was also an Irish immigrant, and progressively over time they wrote her out of that story because it just didn't fit the profile that they wanted. So there was a time when we did know more about the women who participated in the growth of New Zealand, and it's only now that through the work of such people like Lauren and other institutions that those stories are getting written back into history, so that we can start to recognise and know these women and have their names coming off the tip of our tongues like they do for the men pioneers that we know. I did want to ask you, there was, so I think at one time you mentioned in the book that the 4 major hotels are run by women in
Yes.
Queenstown. But there was also something to do with liquor licences as well that was kind of created a threat to that. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah. At one point in Queenstown, the 4 major hotels were run by widows. So Eichardt's was run by Julia Eichardt. Her mother, Jane O'Meara, ran the Supreme Court. Rebecca Bond, who's the subject of my next book, ran the Empire Hotel, which is now called the Cardrona Hotel. When she was widowed, she went and ran the Mountaineer, which is in Queenstown. And there's another Jane McBride who ran the Harp of Erin. So there's 4 women, 4 widows controlled the 4 main hotels in Queenstown. And that caused a bit of a stink because Jane McBride got the license over a man who thought he should get it because men should be represented at the higher levels in hotel keeping. But she still got it. Liquor licenses could be held by virtuous women, not by single women, virtuous married women, but also by widows. So one of the great things about being a hotelier is if you had children, you brought your children up alongside you. You taught your children how to run the hotel business. You didn't have to have a lot of money to start a hotel. On the goldfields, you'd need a bit of canvas, a bit of wood for a bar and a few bottles, and some glass cleaning rags. So it didn't take money. And when your husband died, the business and the liquor license went to you, so long as you remained virtuous. And then when the temperance movement came out, they tried to stop women running hotels, especially if they had attractive barmaids. Because the thought was that these attractive women were taking men out of their homes and feeding them alcohol and bad ideas. So for a while there was a real push. It started, I think, in Australia and then came here to just not have barmaids anymore. One of the problems in the goldfield with the barmaids is they would come from overseas, they'd get fully trained up by the owner of the bar, and then some miner would come along and take them away. And women would last about 2 weeks working in the bars before someone took them away. So one manager decided that he would get the ugliest barmaid anyone had ever seen. And so he auditioned a number of women and he chose the ugliest one. And she lasted 3 days before she left with a miner. There's a wonderful book called Wanted, A Beautiful Barmaid, and it goes through the history of barkeeping and hotel keeping in New Zealand. It's a really good book.
Okay. I hope this is not a spoiler alert, but Julia's husband does die, and just in case it's a trigger, and she goes to wearing black.
She does.
Which that was something I wasn't really aware about, and I was wondering, can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, it was important to wear mourning. You wore black, only black, for 1 year, unless you were Queen Victoria and you wore it for the rest of your life. And then you could begin to put little cuffs on after a year, little slightly coloured things, not bright. You had to wear mourning. It was what you did, and it was what she did. And we've got some pictures of her looking particularly grim, really, wearing some dark clothes. I think we've got, there's Julia. Now she would have been then in about her mid-40s. It's when she was married to Albert. And there's a photograph of her mother sitting in that same chair. I haven't brought it today. And one of her little sister, who would have been 11 or 12, all taken with that same really rigid posture and quite grim look. So that's Dear Julia. And the next picture, I think, it's the next one. Oh, that's what Queenstown was like when Julia arrived in 1862. And you can see all of the pubs along there. On the far right, is Eichardt's Hotel. At that stage it was called the Queen's Arms Tavern. And it was the first hotel in Queenstown, and it was made out of the wool shed of William Rees. So he had the license to run sheep on that land. What happened when these guys first arrived in New Zealand? They wanted to be landowners, they wanted to be lords of all they surveyed. He and von Tunzelman stood at the top of the Crown Range and looked down and saw Queenstown and imagined it as this place with sheep everywhere and a lovely little homestead and a beautiful place to raise a family just on the edge of that lake. So he put up a shearing shed. He had to stock the whole place within a year or he would lose the license. He picked up sheep in Bluff, and these sheep were driven overland to Queenstown. They had to swim rivers. They had to do amazing things to get these sheep to stock the land to hold the license. And in those days, any land that Māori weren't actively living on with big buildings and palisades and things was called wasteland. And it didn't matter that this land was where they travelled in their seasonal looking for food. It didn't matter that this was ancestral land. It was called wasteland. And if you could put fences on it and put stock on it within a year of getting the licence, it was effectively yours. So that's what William Rees did. And he got to his first shearing in this beautiful shearing shed, and someone found gold up the road. And because they found gold up the road, Queenstown was declared a gold field. And so he lost his licence. He lost this beautiful place that he'd planned to live in for the rest of his life. And all these hotels went up. Initially, they were all canvas with a bit of corrugated iron sometimes. But these are starting to get a little bit more established. But there were more bars than anything else, because it was the path to the goldfield. And the people who made money on the goldfield weren't the miners particularly. The very early miners sometimes made a lot of money, but the ones that came after never did. But the people who sold them their provisions made money. The people who gave them their alcohol. The sex workers who followed them. The dancers. The packers. They were the people who made money. Oopsie. One of these hotels is owned by the guy who first struck gold at Arthur's Point, which is just up the road from Queenstown. I can't see which one it is now. But that was what Queenstown looked like when Julia arrived. So there was already a little wooden building that was repurposed sheep shearing shed that she and Albert later reimagined in stone and rebuilt over several stages. What's our next picture? That was the big flood of 1867, I think. One thing that people weren't used to was that when the really big snows came, and there were terrible snows for about 3 years in a row, then the balmy spring weather would come, and they'd think, oh, it's spring, how lovely. But all that snow melted, and it went zooming down the canyons and the gullies, washed out all the miners' encampments, and rose to about 6 feet inside Eichardt's hotel. At one point, I think one of the rivers running into Wakatipu was 40 feet higher than normal. So everyone was flooded out. And the next picture is another one that I think shows Eichardt. So there's Eichardt's hotel on the corner. There's Albert Eichardt standing up the top. And the flood has come all the way up that street, Balance Street, I think, and Rees Street is off to that side. So within a few years of doing their big hotel, making this wonderful place that was flooded and was thought initially to be irredeemably flooded and damaged, but they managed to fix it. See, all the men have got their hats on. There is a photo too of some women being evacuated. I haven't brought it. And they're all beautifully, gorgeously dressed with little fur wraps and things. I thought when I first saw the photograph that they were tourists, that they'd come to see all this damage, but they were actually being evacuated out of Eichardt's hotel in a boat and were being taken up the road to another hotel. And the next picture. So religion was a really big issue back then too. Now Albert Eichardt had been raised as a Catholic, But because he was a businessman in a new community, he wanted to be with the other businessmen as a Mason. So the Freemasons, it was kind of a social and business grouping of men. But if you were a Freemason, you couldn't be buried as a Catholic, because Freemasonry was seen as a secret society and was the antithesis of what Catholicism stood for, apparently. So Albert converted to Anglicanism. So when he died, he was buried with his brothers in the Anglican section of the cemetery. Julia was buried in the Catholic section of the community, because Julia was Catholic and never gave up her faith. So Julia's grave is next, and they now reside probably about 30 feet from each other. So they're not in the same room, but they're in the same house. And it's probably a kind of happy way to be. Yeah, so religion was a really big deal. One of the things that was reported in the newspapers as Julia lay dying. Now, Julia died from a traumatic brain injury. If you're ever at Eichardt's Hotel, you can see that they've got very, very thick window slabs made of stone. And one day when she was 54, it was Good Friday, she was just walking down the steps from her hotel to go up to the grave to visit Albert. And she tripped on a piece of wood that had been left by a builder. She took 15 days to die, and she died in her hotel. But one of the things that was reported in the newspapers, that even though she was a proud Catholic woman, even the Methodists and Presbyterians said prayers for her. All of the businesses in town closed down. People told each other to hush in the streets. Don't disturb Mrs. Eichardt. One of the things that I found researching this book, which was to me the most amazing thing, was those days for traumatic brain injury. There were neurosurgeons. Okay, you had chloroform and you could knock people out. You had saws, you can open their skulls and take clots off their brain, but there weren't any antibiotics because they didn't come until 1927. And there wasn't the understanding of the germ theory of disease, not like we have it now. So you didn't really have to wash your hands that much if you were a surgeon or a nurse. And many, many people who had these operations died from infection, if they didn't die from shock. So you had a specialist neurosurgeon from Dunedin Hospital came up to see Julia Eichardt as she was dying and decided it was too late to do an operation on her brain. I thought they were very brave, the doctors then and the patients. You know, malaria means bad air. People believed that you got sick because the air that you breathed was bad. And it was bad because there was bad stuff in the swamps and there was bad smells and that'd all make you sick. And there was nothing that could fix it. So things are a little better these days.
We have 5 copies of your book in the library, and we have about 15 holds on them. And
Wow.
I had to get my own copy because I couldn't get one out of the library. When I was doing 7th form history, our teacher asked us, did we want to do English history or we wanted to do New Zealand history? And we all unanimously said English history. And I think that there seems to me a transition over time where we seem to be growing in our interest of our own history. And I think we now seem to be looking at that earlier colonial, the more sort of difficult or nuanced part of our history.
Yeah.
Is that do you think that's some of the popularity behind your book?
I think it is. I think that we're starting to look at our history a little closer and examine even the uncomfortable bits. And there are some uncomfortable bits. First, I didn't want the word colonial to go on the cover of the book because that's got such connections with colonisation, and that is really upsetting to many people. I think reading the book, most of the people who came to New Zealand came here because they had awful lives where they were. They had no hope for themselves and their kids, and they wanted to belong to a place where there was the chance for a future. Most of the people who came here weren't horrible people. You know, there were one or two ratbacks. So I think that we're starting to wrestle a bit with that stuff and be able to sit with it a bit more. And it's easier to read history when it's written as a novel, I think. You know, it's much easier. When we had coffee, you asked about where I got a lot of the information from for the book. Because Julia actually left no letters, she left no diaries. When she and Albert got married, there was 2 sentences in the newspaper. Other people getting married around that time, you got to know what the bridesmaids wore and that the bride had a lovely little bouquet with bits of gorse in it, flowering gorse. It was just so precious then. There was nothing for Julia and Albert. There's nothing in the archives at the hotel. There were no floor plans, there was nothing. So to find out all I could about her, I went into Papers Past. And if you don't know that, it's a National Library treasure where you can go and put someone's name in and some dates and the area in which you're interested, and they will bring out all the newspaper cuttings that mention that person. There was some fantastic stuff. You had to dig a little deep. But I think the most interesting place where I found information was births, deaths and marriages. If someone's been dead for 100 years, for $25 you can get their marriage certificate, their birth certificate, their death certificate. And these things had information that you couldn't find anywhere else. Julia's marriage certificate tells you that she's been in New Zealand for X many years, I think it was 12 years. We couldn't find her arrival anywhere. Went through all of the archives. Because I think at the time she arrived in New Zealand, about 14,000 people per week were going through Dunedin. They're all muddied and dispersing, and they just didn't keep up with the paperwork. Also, there was a flood, and archives were destroyed. So we found out then the year that she had arrived in New Zealand. The people who signed her marriage certificate as witnesses were the doctor who later signed her death certificate, Dr. James Douglas, and her stepsister, Bessie Ryan. So we knew that Julia's family had come to New Zealand in time to witness her getting married. The death certificates have how many children did this person have when they died, what ages were the children, what sexes were they, where was the person born, what was their occupation, what was their father's occupation, and all that stuff. And little squiggly handwriting is available if you ever want to check out your own family history, or you're just being nosy. You can, for $25.
And just to add to that, we have a genealogy section at the library. So there's computers you can use. You've got free access to platforms like Ancestry and Find My Past, and you also, most importantly, have access to the most amazing genealogy volunteers who are really skilled and experienced at helping to track down the stories. So if you're interested in finding your own past, then I recommend you drop in and check it out. Yeah.
The other thing is, if you go on Papers Past, if you've got a Real Me ID, the papers have been photographed. So you've got photographs of the actual newsprint as it appeared, and then a computer has translated it. And the computers make awful mistakes. You know, they see a little blotch on the paper and they think it's a funny letter and they try and put it in. But you can edit that. So if you go into Papers Past, look at what you want, and if you see it has mistakes, you can go through and edit it for the next person who's going to read or research it. And it's a way of feeling like you're giving back. I like doing it. But you've got to, every 5 minutes, save it, otherwise everything you've done disappears.
Did you find it tricky writing about people who whose descendants are alive and well now?
Yeah, it does. Julia and Albert had no children, and we don't know why. One or other of them, or both of them, must have had a fertility issue. So they had no kids. But Julia's brothers and sisters had kids, and I was in contact with some of them as I was writing the book. There's one point in the book about Julia where she's dying and she's thinking about all the people that she's known, and she makes a critical comment. I made a critical comment about William Rees. And all the comment was William Rees had this beautiful place. It was wonderful. And then all the miners came. And the life that he thought he was going to have was destroyed. So he reimagined his life, and he started hauling goods from Kingston through to Queenstown on his boat. And sometimes at 2 o'clock in the morning, there'd be 200 miners waiting there to get from him flour or mutton or tobacco or sugar. And I imagined at 2 in the morning, this man who's being dragged out of his bed by these miners who are angry because they're not getting enough, might just hold on to that flour just a second too long, because he's had enough and he's not a saint. And I thought, he's got descendants and they're going to hate it. Yeah. But I decided to leave it because I think he's one of the people in Queenstown history who's been sanctified. And I think if my life had been upturned the way his had, I'd have been pissy and I would have held on to that flower a little bit too long too. So yeah, there is a problem of writing about people whose descendants are still alive. The next book that I'm writing is about, I think, what's our next thing? It's about Rebecca Bond. And this was called the Empire Hotel when she and her husband George opened it. Now, Rebecca had 8 children, I think. I sometimes get it mixed up with Julia. When she died, she owned property still in Cardrona and in Queenstown. And in about 1980, the council realised that these bits of landholding hadn't had rates paid on them for years. So they set out to find Rebecca's descendants to say, wow, have we got a nice little piece of land for you and a really big rates bill. So yeah, that's my next book. And so she does still have descendants, but they'd scattered, and it took a team of lawyers quite a long time to find them. One still lives in Waipukaro, I think. So there were all sorts of stories about her children, about how one had become a nun and 3 of them hadn't had kids because they were probably gay, and but it turns out that they're still around, and I'm going to be writing about their ancestors, so I'll do my best to play nice. And the next book that I'm doing is about this man called Bendix Hellenstein. And his descendants approached me when we were releasing Julia's book. So this is written with the cooperation and support of his descendants. So that book's going to be out in 2028. The Rebecca book's going to be out in 2027. I almost screwed up the writing of the Bendix book, because when we did this thing at Eichardt's Hotel to release the Julia book, and there was a man sitting there who put his hand up, who asked some questions and identified himself as Bendix Hellenstein's great-grandson. And he was sitting next to a woman, and I was really busy, and my contact lenses weren't working properly, and I was a bit fuddled. Anyway, he sent me a text, and I said, oh, look, it was so lovely to meet you, and I'm so delighted you brought your mother with you to the thing. And it was his wife, of course it was his wife. So I thought that I had soured that relationship before it even started. But fortunately, they were very forgiving.
Thank you so much. It's been lots of awesome stories and facts. I was just wondering if there's any questions that we have from the audience.
Do you do your own research or have other people to help you?
I do it. I do have an editor called Nicola McCloy who's written a couple of books about Otago. And when I had Julia saying to her mother, look, there's a tree here called the Pahutakawa that flowers at Christmas time, she said, nah, don't get Pahutakawa in Queenstown. Oh. It's a North Island tree.
Yes.
You know, so there's the odd little thing that I got wrong because I don't know Otago terribly well at all. In fact, when I first went to medical school in Dunedin in 1987, it was when everyone loved to get suntans, right? And I used to go to a tanning clinic, and I didn't know where there was one in Dunedin. And all these people came back after the holidays, after the students' break, and they had wonderful suntans. And I said, where did you get your tan? At Central. And I thought there was a suntan clinic called Central, but they were talking about Central Otago. So I didn't know Otago terribly well at all. So it's always helpful to have someone who doesn't know, you know, who knows what you don't know and can fill in the gaps. Julia came from concept to being in the bookshops in 8 months, which was just such a tight timeline. So if you read it, you'll notice that there are a couple of typos in there, and yeah, the facts are right, but sometimes the history's not beautifully blended in like it will be for the next 2 books.
So was Julia born in Australia?
No, she was
actually born in Ireland?
She was born in Tipperary.
And would she have had an Irish accent, do you think?
No, not particularly. Her brother, Sylvester Shanahan, was born aboard the boat, and he spent his whole life changing his name. So he went from Sylvester John Shanahan to Sylvester John Shannon because it sounded more English, because it didn't pay to be visibly Irish back then. And when he died, he was playing John Shannon. So he spent years changing himself. So no, Julia, as far as we know, didn't have an Irish accent. She had the Irish pale skin and pink cheeks. Yeah. Her mother had an accent. Her mother was very accented.
I'm one of the genealogists at the library, and we're getting more and more, we get a wide range of people looking for various things.
Yeah.
But we're getting more emphasis on trying to find parents and what did mother do? She was married, she had these children, but we're getting an emphasis now of what else did she do?
Yes.
You know, which is really lovely to see.
Yeah.
And it makes me look back at my grandmother and the following great-grandmothers and look at how they held the families together and how they helped husbands run businesses like a hotel or a boarding house and stuff like that, which is really lovely to see, because as you mentioned Smith and Coe, my grandmother worked there, and when I was looking into the history of the fire, which she was present at, I did discover what you were saying, and I'm thinking, why are these women being cut out of this history of New Zealand? So it's lovely that you're bringing that forward, and that we can bring it forward for the people who are now interested more about just a name of a female.
Yeah.
That's really good. Really nice.
I'm noticing as I get older that I really regret that I didn't ask my grandparents things, because my grandparents came out from Ireland when they were young. Some came from Cornwall, but some from Ireland, and I don't know what their parents did.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm putting my time into finding other people's families now. And I talk to kids, like my daughter's kids, and say, you know, do you know? And they no. And they're not interested. You seem to get more interested as you get older. We have to make history more interesting for kids.
It's a lot easier now trying to find more information than when I first started out, because you had to write emails or letters and pay for everything. So it's a lot easier now for a lot of people if they do want to research that. Like my daughters are in their 30s and they're now starting to ask questions where they're never interested before, and I'm getting their friends asking me questions about their things. It's nice to see that generation asking. So,
It is, yeah.
But I say interview people. If you've still got a grandmother and an elderly aunt, interview them.
Absolutely.
So,
Ask them and write it down.
Exactly.
Write it down. My grandfather came out from Ireland when he was a baby, and when he died, he was about 97, 98, and was quite demented when he died. But he died still furious with Cromwell. And he said, if it wasn't for Cromwell, I'd be Lord Fermoy. I said, oh, Granddad, there's been kind of a lot of water under the bridge since then. But it was really interesting just looking at what brought the Irish people here. Yeah, and how they were treated when they got here too. You know, nowhere near as good as the English.
Interesting.
Yes.
Is there a difference with the treatment of Scottish and Irish?
There was actually. The Scots were seen as being hard-working, and the Irish were seen as being drunkards with too many children. You know.
Was it also a matter of education? The Scottish were more educated than Irish.
They were, but that wasn't the fault of the Irish.
No.
You know, they just had centuries of being dispossessed of their land and being ground down. And, you know, there were the big Highlands clearances in Scotland too. But the Scots who came out were very keen on education and Presbyterianism. I was reading this morning about some pretty hefty fights that went on in Parliament about whether or not Presbyterianism should be part of the school curriculum. Sort of what they're doing in America now. Do we have to have prayer in every classroom? And it was outvoted. But, you know, there was a really strong, we should do this because that's why we came here. We came here to defend our faith as well as save our lives.
Maybe that's why we were so fragmented as a country initially, because there were so many cultures coming in or so many beliefs coming in.
Yeah.
And they weren't strong enough to stand up and be one because there wasn't enough of them.
Yeah, they could well be. It also surprised me how many Germans and Russians and Dutch people were in New Zealand. You know, all mixed together. You know,
Yes.
and the Chinese. So the Chinese gave the Irish somebody to look down on. I read that in a letter to the editor. You know, we're better than someone, and it's like, Rebecca Bond's got a really interesting connection with Parihaka. So Rebecca Bond's son was a dentist. And when Parihaka was stormed and the profits were taken away, Te Whiti was one of the ones who was taken down to Dunedin. And Rebecca Bond's son pulled his teeth out when he had toothache. So there you go. There's a connection you didn't ever expect. And that came through a very racist newspaper article. But,
Oh, sorry. Was there another question? I was just going to say everybody in New Zealand is connected, so that doesn't surprise me. If there's no more questions, I just want to say, sorry about that. Thank God that happened at the end. I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'd like especially to thank Lauren for the time and the effort and for the great sharing of your knowledge that you gave us today. I would also just like to say the next Heritage Talk is actually going to be a workshop run on the 22nd of April, time and place to be confirmed, and that it's going to be on someone from Heritage New Zealand is going to come up and teach us about how to research your house, so how to do research for a specific building. So anybody, if you'd like to go to that and you're not already on our email list, just add your name to our email list, and and we'll get notified about that. All right.
And I would have told anyone who wanted to buy a book to go to Yvonne's at Book Inn in Carmore. And if you don't know, Yvonne died a couple of days ago. And there's a memorial for her on Tuesday at the Kama Memorial Hall. She has, yes. Yep, that's what I'm saying. That's what I would have said. And bless Yvonne, because she had just the best bookshop, and she was such an advocate for New Zealand writers and local writers and Māori writers. So if you want to say goodbye to Yvonne, it's at midday on Tuesday at the Campbell Memorial Hall, and there's something at 5 p.m. in her bookshop on Tuesday. I do have some books. I've got 3 copies of Julia Eichardt, if anyone would like to buy one, and one of Mila and the Bone Man.
Okay. So thank you. Put your hands together for Lauren.
Thank you.